Hello, Alex here, and in this video I want to talk about the Thypoch Simera 75mm f1.4, a short telephoto lens with a fast maximum aperture and absolutely outstanding image quality. Let's get into it. When I visited the photography show in London back in March, I stopped by the Thypoch booth because I'd seen reviews of some of their lenses online, including from my friend Hashim over at Pushing Film, but I'd never actually seen one of them in person. I later connected with their marketing team after introducing myself and asked if they'd be willing to loan me a copy of the 75mm so that I could access the lens in exchange for me making a review, to which they obliged. However, I did end up basically buying them out and paying for this lens because I decided to keep it. So that tells you how I feel about this thing right off the bat. Either way, I'm very grateful for the opportunity that they've given me. And in the last 5 or so weeks, I've used this lens both on my Zeiss Icon as well as a couple of my digital cameras, and I've gotten quite a good feel for it very quickly. Thypoch are a relatively new lens brand whose name is a portmanteau of Thigh and Epoch, meaning your time. Their website says they produce lenses with high optical quality and a unique character, so not totally clinical and overly perfect as many modern mirrorless lenses tend to be. The 75mm f1.4 spherical lens is part of the Simera lineup, also including the 28, 35 and 50mm lenses along with the very recently announced 21mm.
Opening the box, you'll find your warranty information and a certificate of quality, a copy of the lens hood with the lens cap pre-installed, and the lens itself.
The lens is about 65mm wide across pretty much the whole length of the barrel, and it comes in at 63mm long, extending by a further 15mm on close focusing. It weighs a hair under 400 grams, so it's not a featherweight, but it balances quite well even on relatively light cameras like my Zeiss Icon, and it has an all-metal build from the front filter thread down to the lens mount, available in both black and silver finishes. This is a prime lens, so it doesn't zoom and it has a fixed focal length of 75mm, a short telephoto field of view. That gives you a lot more emphasis on your subject and distinctly focuses on details within a scene or an isolated element in a broader scene than you would see with something like a 50mm, but it doesn't force you to shoot from so far away that you lose all sense of intimacy and closeness to the subject like you do with something like a 105 or a 35, or even to a lesser extent a 90mm lens. 75mm is one of my favorite focal lengths for stills and portraits, especially as a complement to a 35mm lens. Retailing for about €750 or $850 ex VAT, so before tax, it is the most expensive lens in the Simera lineup by a significant margin, though you'll see that money isn't exactly wasted. And along with the 50mm, it's only available in the Leica M mount, where the 28 and 35 are available in a range of mirrorless mounts, though I am able to confirm that the 50mm will be coming in at least one other mount soon down the line. If these lenses aren't available in your mirrorless mount of choice though, M mount to whatever adapters are broadly available and very cheap. This M-mount lens is of course rangefinder coupled from infinity down to 0.7 meters, giving you a max reproduction ratio of 1:8 and a max magnification of 0.12x, which is by no means super close, but in the rangefinder world is very impressive. However, this lens can also focus closer down to 0.6 meters, giving you a max reproduction ratio of 1:6.5 or a max magnification of about 0.17x, but giving you the ability to get a lot closer to your subject and focus on an even smaller detail when shooting in live view or when adapting to a mirrorless camera. And thankfully, the focusing ring does have a click at 0.7 meters to tell you that you're about to lose rangefinder coupling if you focus any closer, so you have good tactile feedback there. The front of the lens bears a metal 58mm filter thread, and filters can be used alongside the included lens hood, which attaches via an outer bayonet. The aperture range starts from f1.4 at the widest and closes down to f16 at the narrowest, albeit with an odd pattern. From f1.4 to 4, each stop takes 3 clicks, then there are 2 clicks from f4 to 5.6, and then whole clicks from f5.6 down to f16. If you prefer, the aperture ring can be declicked using one of the wing tabs on the aperture ring itself, with the sun setting corresponding to a clicked aperture and the moon setting corresponding to a declicked aperture. That doesn't make too much intuitive sense to me, so I like to think of the moon as night mode and night mode being the quiet one. The iris itself is made of 16 rounded aperture blades for smooth out of focus regions in your images, though others in their reviews have noted that despite that, The high manufacturing tolerance of the blades can give you strong sun stars at very narrow apertures, though it's not something I've really seen because I haven't really been using this lens stopped down too far myself. Below the aperture ring, you'll find the analog depth of field calculator that reminds me of the C-series Hasselblad lenses and fills in a series of red dots as you change your focusing distance and aperture. It is nice to see consistency of design with the rest of the Simera lenses, but to be honest, even at f16, the depth of field you're getting with a 75mm lens really does limit the utility of this focusing scale. The focusing ring is scalloped, with engraved markings in both metric and imperial. The ring turns about 110 degrees between infinity and 0.7 meters, and a further 20 or so degrees to 0.6 meters. The focusing ring on this copy of the lens turns extremely smoothly with just enough resistance that you're not going to accidentally bump it, but without being so difficult to turn. I can turn it with one finger when I need to, and it stays where I set it. The lens doesn't have an infinity lock or a focusing tab, which are both fine for a 75mm lens, I would say, and there's no focusing index for infrared light either, which I don't think is such a big deal on a 75mm lens, but might be nice to have it, 1.4 or f2. And of course, the rear of the lens bears the Leica M mount, making it compatible natively with any M mount body, film or digital. The lens correctly engages your frameline selector in position 2, giving you, on most cameras, 50 or 50 and 75mm frame lines. I don't have 75mm frame lines in the Zeiss Icon, so I've just been winging it by using a grid sort of inside the 50mm frame lines. I'll throw a screenshot up here of how I use that, and that works well enough, but that is something that I'll come back to in a bit more detail later. Finally, the optical design, which consists of 9 elements in 8 groups, incorporating 1 aspherical element, 2 extra low dispersion ED elements, and 2 high refractive index HRI elements. It also employs a rear fixed group floating element design, where the rear optical group closest to the lens mount stays in a fixed position and the rest of the optical block moves back and forth as you focus, ensuring high image quality with high contrast and high sharpness, even at very close focusing distance, minimizing things like residual spherical aberration. But why specifically 75mm though? This is a really unpopular focal length, especially nowadays. It used to be a bit more popular, but today you're not really going to see 75s pop up that often. And they are making a bit of a resurgence in the modern mirrorless autofocus market, especially with the Chinese manufacturers. But you're not really going to see 70 to 75mm in most situations beyond it being the end of a zoom lens like a 28 to 75 or 24 to 70. If you take a 50mm lens and throw that on an APS-C camera not made by Canon, you're going to get a 1.5x crop with a 75mm equivalent field of view. That is what I grew up with. I had my Nikon D90 and my AFD 50mm f1.8 for like 11 years before I eventually moved on to a full-frame camera. And that is something I just completely fell in love with as my everyday stills, portraits, and like details kind of lens. Like I said, you get nice and close to your subject. You're not shooting from so far away, like with a 105 or 135, that you don't feel any physical connection to the subject. It's the same idea if you're familiar with the reason people would shoot 35mm over a 50mm as their everyday lens, including me. It's that extra closeness to your subject and the extra feeling of intimacy. It's exactly the same thing for me with a 75 versus something like a 90 or a 105. But on the rangefinder side of things, being a rangefinder user, there are 2 other reasons. The first is that a typical rangefinder focuses no closer than 0.7 meters, whether you're using a 21mm lens or potentially a 90mm lens. And all but 2 90mm lenses that I'm aware of bottom out or top out, depending on how you look at it, at 1 meter, where all 75mm that I'm aware of focus down to 0.7 meters. And that actually does give you a higher maximum magnification. The other thing is just that with a rangefinder, focusing very long and very fast lenses is quite difficult. So for equivalent aperture, if you can get away with a 75mm, you're going to have deeper depth of field and a bit more wiggle room in your focusing than you are with something like a 90mm. First and foremost, the lens has extraordinary image quality. Like, it really is genuinely excellent, and probably the highest quality film compatible lens that I've personally ever used. We're talking no visible distortion, extremely well controlled chromatic aberration and loca that only pop up in the most extreme of circumstances, well controlled vignetting that's, I'd say, only a problem in real world shooting if you're shooting a very flat wall, like in I don't know, an art studio, a white wall, or shooting the sky wide open or at f2, then you're going to see some vignetting, but I don't think it's particularly heavy, as well as extremely high contrast under almost all circumstances and extremely high resolution. The center is pretty much perfect at every focus distance at f4, and yes, the corners are weaker, but between f2.8 to f4, depending on the resolution of your camera, you're going to see a tack sharp image across the frame, even on a digital camera, which is ridiculous. That close minimum focusing distance of 0.6 meters is very much appreciated, and even the 0.7 meters on a rangefinder camera is very nice. But 0.6 meters gives you a nice bit of closeness if you're using this on a digital camera, say with live view or adapted to a mirrorless camera as well. There are other 75 to 85mm lenses that can focus closer, and those do typically have autofocus, but they are also typically f2 to f2.8 lenses. I'm not aware of another 75-ish f1.4 lens that focuses as close as this one. So it's, if not a class leader, if there is something, a counterexample out there, it's one of the best on the market in that regard. And the use of the floating element design ensures that you maintain the optical quality even at very close distances, which is very important for how I would use a lens like this. Yeah, it's nice to use a 75 for landscapes to get some details and, a crop of a broad scene, but for me it's really about getting fine details close up with the subject, and being able to maintain my contrast and overall image quality at those distances is very important for my particular use case. It's also worth noting that there's no focus shift with this lens design at all. So that's extraordinarily important with a film camera with a rangefinder. On a digital camera, it's not the end of the world because you're going to be composing with the aperture stopped down on a mirrorless camera or the like. But for a rangefinder at f2, f2.8, I can go to the minimum focusing distance if I'm careful and get a perfectly sharp image every time. It should go without saying, but the build quality is absolutely incredible. I mean, the fit and finish are tremendous. Everything fits very tightly and snugly, like I've said, and the focus ring has just the perfect level of resistance. It's also worth noting that the rangefinder calibration, which is not adjustable to my knowledge, was absolutely flawless out of the box. f1.4, 75mm from infinity to the minimum focusing distance. I checked, and it is bang on. The price is quite hefty. As I said, it is the most expensive lens in the Simera line, but I think it brings a lot to the table and the value proposition is extremely high, especially if you're going to be adapting this to a digital camera. Of course, this lens is significantly less expensive than something like the 75 Summilux, but that doesn't really directly compete in this lens. That's quite a soft, glowy character lens that's coveted for the look that it brings, rather than strictly high optical quality. So then you're realistically looking at comparing this lens to something like the Voigtlander 75mm Nokton or even the 75mm Ultron, which is a smaller lens that also focuses to, I believe, 0.6 meters, but doesn't have the same level of optical quality. The Nokton is the most similar competitor, being a 75mm f1.5, but that lens is a bit heavier. It doesn't have a floating element design, so it does get quite a bit worse at close focusing distance, which itself may not be too bad, but in a side-by-side would really show against this lens, and it's actually a bit more expensive than the Thypoch, so I've also heard some negative comments about the build quality of the 75 Nokton, which is one of the reasons that I haven't tried one myself yet. The lens offers extremely smooth rendering of out-of-focus areas, aka creamy bokeh, with no texturing or onion ringing in the out-of-focus highlights, the bokeh balls, thanks to extremely high precision in the manufacturing of these spherical elements used in the lens design. In some cases, you can even get a sort of 3D pop look, which doesn't happen super often and which I would typically associate with a wide lens like a 35mm lens myself, but when it's there, it's quite prominent. And I know it's a very controversial term to use, the 3D pop, but if you ask me, it's basically high resolution with a narrow depth of field and a very smooth focus fall off, and this lens brings all three of those things to the table. And with a 75, you're not going to see it as much as something with like a 35 or maybe a 50, but it definitely pops up from time to time, and you can really get that three-dimensional separation of your subject from the background. There is also a little truncation of the out-of-focus highlights, aka cat's eye bokeh, but it is something I generally personally like to a moderate degree, and if you stop down to like f2, it pretty much completely goes away, and by f4 it's completely gone if you want to just tone it down a little bit. The other thing is that using 58mm filter threads is very nice and very welcome, unlike other lenses I own that use things like 55mm threads. 58 is a very standard size if you don't shoot Nikon, and it just means that the filters are broadly very available and quite affordable. I somehow completely missed this before actually getting my hands on the lens, but it covers the 44x33mm sensors of the GFX and XCD mount cameras. And yet the truncation of cat's eye bokeh, the vignetting, and the optical quality are all a little bit worse because you're going further off the optical axis. But even at f1.4, at 100 megapixels, this lens holds up in the center. Closer to f2, you get much further out towards the edges of the frame while maintaining very, very high image quality, which is something I did not expect and brings a whole other level of value to this lens for me, because I'm really down in the dumps about my GF 80mm lens. I'll probably talk about that compared to the Thypoch at some other point down the line. As much as Thypoch state this as one of the strengths of the optical design, I've had very mixed experiences with flare resistance. When you have a light source within the frame, like a strongly backlit shot, you're going to see very warm-toned, cinematic veiling flare that covers the whole frame. And that makes sense because it goes back and harkens to the cinematic background of the lens designs that go into these Simera lenses. But when you have a point light source just outside the edge of the frame, or if you have multiple light sources within the frame, like when shooting through a tree canopy, you can get some less appealing, quite nasty flare blobs in very certain situations. I've only seen this happen a couple of times in several hundred shots, many rolls of film and many hundreds of shots on my digital cameras. But I'm thinking as a rangefinder user, I wouldn't know if that were happening at the time because I'm not composing through the lens. So I tend to use this lens with the lens hood, which gives an extra bit of protection, of course. But it would be nice if I didn't feel like I had to. It's something I'm going to explore a bit more and use the lens without the hood a bit more. But for the purpose of getting good quality images for the review, I stuck with using the hood. And that's where my only negative point with the build quality comes in. Although this lens does have a very nice quality hood and the push fit cap for the lens itself is great, the push fit cap for the lens hood is a bit looser and I would be worried about potentially losing it. So I do want to stick some felt or something in there to try and tighten it up. I have to mention the uneven spacing of the aperture stops and the uneven number of clicks per stop could drive you absolutely crazy. I found that in reality it doesn't bother me as much as it did, as I thought it would, because using a 75 I tend to be a lot more deliberate and slow with my shooting than I do with a 35, where I'm a lot more snap happy and I need to go from f1.4 to f6.3 or whatever quite easily without thinking. With this lens, I'm shooting more slowly, so it's not as big a deal. And unlike the TD Artisan 75mm f1.5 I spoke about before, this lens has very strong clicks. So you can actually feel it and you can build up some different muscle memory. At least from f1.4 to f4, it's 1/3 stop clicks, and that's good enough for shooting at wider apertures. It's not ideal, and it would absolutely drive me crazy with the Simera 28 or 35, but with this lens, at least for the way I use it, it's not as big a deal as I thought it would be in practice. Like I mentioned, as far as rangefinder lenses go, this is quite large and heavy. It's on the upper scale of acceptable for a lot of people, and I know a couple of people who already think this lens is a bit too much. There is some viewfinder blockage with the hood when you're at closer distances in particular, but you know, using this, thinking about my digital cameras, it's very small for such a high optical quality f1.4 lens. Okay, it doesn't have autofocus, which a lot of competing lenses do, but in that kind of market segment, it is absolutely minuscule by comparison. And this is also where I appreciate that the lens does not employ an internal focusing design extending on close focusing, because it means it's smaller when you put it in your bag or when you just, you know, kind of contract it away against the lens hanging off your neck. Versus something like the Simera 35, again, which I feel like I'm ragging on in this lens, but I've just been researching that one a lot while looking at this one, which also has a floating element design, but with a fixed front group, so the lens is always at its maximum size. This one gets a bit more compact when you don't need it, but can extend to give you close focusing when you do need that benefit. My very long rangefinder base length and high magnification give me a very high effective base length on the Zeiss icon, which makes precision focusing very easy. But a 75mm f1.4 is not an easy thing to focus with a rangefinder camera, especially when focusing something that is alive, like a person or a cat. It's a lot easier to misfocus than you might think, and I have, you know, shot under various conditions. The rangefinder calibration is perfect, it's just very difficult to nail focus, and I typically try to stay at f2 to f2.8 light permitting, unless I really want the shallow depth of field. But it is worth bearing in mind that buying a lens like this isn't automatically going to get you good shots. if they're all out of focus. Your rangefinder needs to be perfectly calibrated, and if you're shooting on digital, you're really going to want to make use of your focusing aids. And with the high resolution of this lens, probably better off going to be using magnification rather than something like peaking. Lastly, and this is not exclusive to the Zeiss Icon, a lot of cameras don't have 75mm frame lines. I mentioned that some cameras just have a 50mm, and this camera has 50 and 85mm frame lines, but the 85mm frame lines substitute for 90s in position 3 on the frame line selector. So you can't use a 75mm lens on this camera with the 85mm frame lines unless you're going to stand there holding the frame line selector in every time you're trying to take a shot, which I'm not willing to do. But even outside of the Zeiss world, there are certain Besses that don't have 75mm frame lines. There are lots of Leicas that don't have 75mm frame lines. It's not a universally supported set of frame lines like 50 or almost 35mm. So it is worth bearing in mind that your choice of focal length will impact, well, this is true of any lens, but the choice of focal length that you want to use will have restrictions or impose restrictions on the choice of rangefinder camera that you can use with it, to about the same extent as a 28, I would say. In this video, I also want to draw a couple of comparisons to some other lenses that I own, starting with the Voigtlander 50mm f1.5 Nokton Mark II and the Leica Simera-M 90mm f2 Pre-spherical. These lenses are just the lenses that I own, so we're going to roll with that. And you can see clear as day that the 50mm does not even come close, and with the shorter focal length compared to a 90, the 30cm shorter focus distance of the Thypoch Simera-75 makes a fairly substantial difference, giving the highest magnification of the set. And if you go beyond the realm of rangefinder coupling down to the true minimum focusing distance of 0.6 meters, it's even better again. Not a macro lens, but perfect as an everyday lens. The other thing I want to look at is just center and corner sharpness, wide open and at f4. I don't own test or resolution charts or any of that kind of thing, so I set up my normal test scene when I was going to do some film developing, and with these shots taken at each lens's minimum focusing distance, you can see that the Thypoch has vastly superior image quality with less residual spherical aberration, higher resolution, higher contrast, and less chromatic aberration. And that's especially impressive when you consider that neither of the other two lenses are bad lenses by any stretch of the imagination. The 50mm in particular is a very well-regarded lens. The other thing I wanted to look at was general image quality at moderate focusing distances. Yes, lenses tend to perform worse at their minimum focusing distance. That's not really a surprise. And these are all shot wide open, don't forget. So I wanted to have a look at image quality wide open and at f1.4, both in the center and in the corner. Wide open, there's a clear advantage to the Thypoch, with the Leica showing good contrast but lower resolution, and the Voigtlander demonstrating lower contrast and resolution with some spherical aberration granting some glow. In practice, the 50mm is excellent for portraits with that little bit of glow kind of smoothing out skin imperfections to a nice amount without negatively impacting image quality. It is a good performer in reality, just to point out that I'm not trying to rag on it too hard here. The 50mm holds up very well in the corner, and the 90 is noticeably weaker, though the Thypoch retains very strong image quality. At f4, all three lenses are excellent near the center, and though the Thypoch is a bit better, I wouldn't say it's a meaningful advantage outside of a side-by-side comparison, but it does retain a bit more of a noticeable advantage in the corner. So those are my thoughts on the Thypoch Simera-M 75mm f1.4 spherical. I have truly fallen in love with this lens. Like I said, I put my money where my mouth is, and I chose to buy this review copy and just keep it. There is some cat's eye bokeh and some vignetting, but that's largely an inherent limitation of the Leica M mount being so narrow, which is fair. You're going to see that with a lot of other fast lenses in the Leica M mount system, but it's not so much that it significantly detracts from image quality. You do retain a little bit of character, but you don't lose the high quality images that this lens is really kind of promising, and it certainly delivers on that. Even using this lens with a camera without 75mm frame lines, I have had no problems using it, and I have had, well, beyond not being able to focus f1.4 as easily as I thought I would, but that's a me problem. I have to say this lens has just been a pleasure and a joy to use, and the fact that I'm going to be able to integrate it so well in both my film and digital kits made it a very easy sell for me. I'm going to have to compare this at some point down the line to the GF 80mm for the GFX camera, because that lens has such bad, slow, loud autofocus that it might as well just not have autofocus, in which case I'd rather have a real manual focusing ring that I can get proper high quality focusing with rather than a focus by wire system, but I do want to have a look at the image quality between those lenses at some point. I'm really grateful to the opportunity that Thypoch have given me and for allowing me to purchase this lens rather than necessarily forcing me to send it back. But that's all I have to say for this video. I truly, genuinely love this lens, and it's one of the highest quality lenses that I have ever used overall. That's all I have to say for this video though. So stay safe, and bye bye for now. If you don't already, follow me on Instagram at Shaka1277 for new pictures every day. If you liked this video and enjoy what I do on the channel, please consider subscribing or checking out my Patreon, where the tiers start at just €1 per month.